They've been called kings, wise men, astrologers, but who were the Magi?
They are really attracted to political powers, politically manipulative. They're interested in astrology or something of that nature.
Today, I'm joined by Dr. Eric Vanden Eykel, who literally wrote the book on the Magi in the Bible. Welcome, Eric. You've actually taken a look at the Magi in their ancient context and all the uses of the Greek term for Magi. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about how they appear in ancient literature. You started your book with the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible.
So the term Magi, I was actually very surprised when I started my research because I was expecting that I would find the term Magi all over the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And in fact, I only found it in one place. I found it in the book of Daniel. And in the book of Daniel, the Magi are sort of advisory figures to the king. And so they are the people that the king calls on when he has the strange dream, and he wants them to help him understand why he's dreamed what he's dreamed. And in the Greek translation of Daniel, Daniel himself is counted among these sort of groups of which the Magi are sort of one subset. So they're sort of these advisory figures who have kind of connections perhaps to the divine, but also the ability to find significance in things that regular people like us can't understand, like dreams.
I noticed when I read the Daniel passages, there's kind of like these three different designations, and then Magi is one of them. But then later, they're all kind of called wise men.
Right, yeah. So there's like, the Magi and the Chaldeans or whatever. And then, the groups, the groups sort of start to bleed together a little bit. And the author or the translator of Greek Daniel isn't really interested in helping us delineate between these groups. So, and I take that as a sign that either this person's readership knows the difference between these groups, or they don't really consider them to be different in any meaningful sense from one another.
But Daniel himself wasn't a Magi.
Yeah, he's sort of in that group, the group that's sort of, again, designated as within these little subsets. In Greek Daniel himself is never explicitly called a magos. But there is, I do think that tradition of identifying him with that group is probably present, or at least it becomes present. But yeah, in Greek Daniel, he's never explicitly called a magus, but he is at the very least peripheral to that group. And in fact, in Greek Daniel, they're not very good at it because the king tells them to, interpret his dream and tell him what he dreamed and all of this. And they say, oh, nobody in the world could tell you what you dreamed. And so essentially the king, they fail the king. And it's not until Daniel comes in that Daniel is able to do what this other larger group isn't able to do. And so they are advisory figures in Daniel, but at least in this instance, they don't succeed at their job, but Daniel does.
And the court tale, it's a very popular genre in ancient literature, where the king has a problem, none of his advisors can solve it, but then an unlikely figure steps up to save the day. You see it in Joseph and Pharaoh, Moses and Pharaoh, Saul and David, the tale of Ahikar the wise. There's a whole bunch of tales from ancient literature.
Right, exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
So what about other ancient literature outside the Bible?
Yeah, so in Herodotus and Plutarch, and really in that chapter, when I look at that term in non-biblical literature, it's, I think, mostly focused on Herodotus, because that's where we get we get scattered references to this term Magi throughout Greek literature, but it's really in Herodotus that they become kind of consistently recurring characters. And so in Herodotus, I look at the way that they are really attracted to political power. So again, in this sort of advisory figure to kings. And so you do have kings who are calling them when they've got strange dreams or when they don't understand something that's happened. And the king will call the Magi in to kind of help out. But also in Herodotus, you have these stories of the Magi who are politically manipulative. So, they'll see a vacancy on the throne, and there's a story of, one Magos putting another Magos on the throne, and then they sort of pretend that he's king for a while.
And that's the story of Cambyses and Guamata, who my viewers should be familiar with if they watched the Ancient Scams video. Because Guamata, he was the one that tricked people into thinking he was the son of Cyrus the Great, and then he sat on the throne until he was assassinated. And then, of course, on top of that, it might just have been a story that Darius made up to justify his reign.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's it's just a wild story. Because the brother Magus who gets on the throne is like there because he kind of looks like the deceased. He looks like this person, and so they're like, "Is that the king?" Well, he looks like, And so it's just it's just kind of a really funny story. So you kind of have, just like in Greek Daniel, in Herodotus, you have Magi who are very much located in royal settings, whether that is in order to kind of help whoever's in power or to usurp whoever's in power, which is a really, really interesting a thing to think about, especially in terms of the role that they play in Matthew in relation to Jesus as king. But also in Herodotus and Plutarch, you get the Magi as religious professionals, and so not just diviners who can predict dreams, but you get them as people who perform sacrifices and other rituals and chant and intercede on behalf of people to the gods. And so really you have them as in both of these authors, they're sort of a combination of religious professional who also serve a political function.
You also talked about how not only did one Magos seize power, but they could also deceive kings through the advice they gave.
Yeah, or just sort of bad advice. And I'm trying to think now. The story of Cyrus, right? When Cyrus's grandfather has this dream that his grandson is going to take over the throne, and so he goes and sends one of his court advisors to like murder the baby, and the court advisor takes him to a shepherd or something, and the shepherd doesn't want to kill him, so he just raises him by himself. And then Cyrus comes back to the town, and he's playing with some boys, and the boys are saying, you are our king or whatever. And then the grandfather catches wind that Cyrus is still alive, and he asks the Magi, like, what should I do about this? And they're like, well, maybe this is what the dream meant, was like, the boys were going to crown him king, and it looks like that's already happened, so you're good to go. And then Cyrus ends up taking over, and so it's like, in that case, they're either, it's not really clear to me at least, they're either trying to manipulate, or they just botch their interpretation. They have the wrong interpretation, perhaps.
I find it interesting then that in Matthew the text says they tricked Herod, almost like they are expected to be deceptive because they are Magi.
When you take the story of the Magi in Matthew and you sort of remove any preconceived notions about what Matthew is doing there, right? And we say, well, they're not trying to usurp power. Well, okay, but they're also looking for the king, right? They're looking for, so why else would they be looking for the king, right? Now, I'm not saying that they are trying to usurp power in Matthew. I don't think they are. But if you're going to this story without any preconceived notions about what they're up to, and all you have is Herodotus, then why not? Why aren't they looking for the king in order to take over, right? And you're absolutely right. In the end, they end up deceiving Herod. They probably didn't set out to deceive Herod, but they ended up doing that anyway. And it's almost as if deception is in their very nature, right? Like that's what you would expect a magus to do, is to deceive a royal figure. So yeah, but it really, the portrait of them in Herodotus just really, I think complicates and forces us to really reread that story in Matthew to say what's actually going on here.
So as an ancient reader, you don't really know whether the Magi are good or bad when they first appear, right?
That's exactly right. And the term itself, I mean, just with all of the primary source work that I did and that I looked at in this book, the term itself is just so loaded with connotations that depend on where you're at coming to that text. So the best example that I can think of in a sort of English context is the term lawyer, right? If you say, there's a lawyer is walking up to my house. Well, that's the start of a story that could go a number of different ways, depending on whether you've done something illegal, or whether there's somebody out to get you, or whether one of your relatives just died and that lawyer is coming to deliver, news of a great inheritance or something. So, the term lawyer in our context is very, very similar, I think, to that term Magi in the ancient world. It really, how that term is understood just depends on the person who's hearing it.
That's a great analogy. So it really depends on the audience. What about Matthew, though? What can we say for sure from Matthew's gospel about the Magi?
So what we learned from Matthew about these specific Magi, or rather, who are the Magi in Matthew? We learn that just like the Magi in Herodotus, who can find significance in, things like dreams, the Magi in Matthew are finding significance in a star that they see, a star that presumably nobody else in the story can really understand or even detect. So they're interested in astrology or something of that nature. We also then learn that just like in Herodotus, that these Magi have the ability to interpret dreams. And in this case, they're interpreting their own dream. But also in Matthew, that doesn't make them unique, because Joseph also has a dream that he's able to understand, right? So, anyway, but I think they're very similar in the sense of being able to find significance in mundane things, and then also their generosity. But in terms of their motivation, that's one of the most interesting questions that Matthew doesn't really say. He gives us a little bit to work with, but the most interesting question of why in the world are they interested in this king, in Jesus, and Matthew just doesn't really tell us, right? Are they there for their own kind of selfish uses? Are they there to worship? Are they there for something else? They come from the east, although Matthew doesn't tell us anything else where they're from. They're just from the east. So it's like really, really broad.
Can we nail that place down at all?
I think it depends on who you ask. I tend to, if we're thinking about it in terms of Matthew's story world, and so, Judea as the center, Matthew is probably not writing in Judea, but he's centering his story in Judea. From that perspective, the East, I think just sort of incorporates that entire kind of region, Persia probably being the most likely place that Matthew is thinking of when he talks about the East, again, on my read. But the East also seems to kind of function as a kind of cipher for that mysterious land out there. And that's what it becomes in some of the later retellings, is sort of this mystical place, way out there, kind of the just kind of a fascination with the Orient. But no, I think for Matthew's purposes, he probably is imagining something like Persia.
I guess that's bolstered by the fact that many of the Magi stories are set in Persia.
Right, exactly, yeah, and that's sort of a consequence not only of Herodotus and the Persian Wars, where we get a lot of this material from, but you've got other sources as well, like Plutarch, who's talking about Magi as sort of Persian Zoroastrians, in that sort of realm. So yeah, there's not, it's the connection with Persia is not universal in terms of all Magi come from Persia, because there's plenty of examples in Greek literature where the Magi are not explicitly from Persia, but I would say the vast majority of them, that's kind of their geographical locus.
And you mentioned the gifts. They're not necessarily evidence that they were wealthy. They just may have, spent a lot of money on them.
Well, so there's a temptation to say they're also wealthy because of the gifts that they bring, which, those are fascinating little pieces of data. So it's tempting to say, oh, look, they're bringing gold and then it's expensive incense and then this expensive fragrance, myrrh. So therefore they must be wealthy. I tend to kind of err on the side of they're not necessarily wealthy. They're just generous, because they're either wealthy or they've sold everything that they own in order to buy these gifts. Right. So, so it's sort of, I think it's tempting sometimes to think about them as these sort of wealthy figures. And maybe that's what Matthew has in mind, but it's also possible that Matthew has in mind that they've sort of sold everything to procure these gifts. Either way, they're depicted as generous. They come to Bethlehem and they offer these gifts. But
I know people who have tried to sort of look for all sorts of metaphorical meaning and significance. So like, this is what the frankincense means, and this is what the gold means, and this is what the myrrh means. Is there anything to that?
So when I was really, one of the most popular interpretations of these gifts is, this kind of metaphorical, the gold signifies the kingship of Jesus, the frankincense signifies either the divinity of Jesus because the incense in the temple and whatever, or it could also signify the priestly nature of Jesus, right? Jesus is the priest who's offering the incense as well as the deity to whom the incense is offered. And then the myrrh as signifying Jesus' humanity or pointing towards his death and burial. Obviously, these are very, very alluring interpretations. I mean, these are, it's like nice and clean and whatever. And so I tried to find evidence in Matthew that this is what Matthew was actually after. And frankly, I didn't find anything. I just didn't find any kind of evidence that, aside from, there are some early interpreters, patristic interpreters, who do connect these gifts with these different pieces of Jesus's perceived identity. But on my read, I just didn't find any connections like that. And so if Matthew is intending for these gifts to be, indicative of some part of Jesus's identity, he's very, very subtle about it in a way that just sort of disappears. What ultimately convinced me that Matthew wasn't interested in these types of connections was the myrrh. And so there's in the story of Jesus's death in Mark, Jesus is offered myrrhed wine. He's offered wine that's been mixed with myrrh when he's on the cross. And Matthew, when he is so in Mark, there's that very clear connection with myrrh with Jesus's death. In Matthew, that doesn't happen. So in Matthew, Jesus is still offered wine, but it's not wine that's mixed with myrrh, it's wine that's mixed with gall. And the reason that's significant is that Matthew is using Mark's passion story to construct his own. And this is about as close to scholarly consensus as you can get. Matthew is using Mark as a source. And in my view, if that is if Matthew intended for us to connect the myrrh with the death of Jesus, well, that's where it would happen. And yet he changes that detail. It's almost like he's trying to destroy the connection rather than to build it. So I sort of took that and said, well, maybe there's actually not. Maybe they're just, my read in the book was, maybe they're just expensive gifts and they're tribute for the king. And there are other instances of people bringing royal tribute, in In fact, there's the number of the psalm right now is escaping me, but there is a psalm where frankincense and myrrh are both brought to a king, which is sort of to say these are expensive gifts that are fitting royalty.
So it's sort of fairly evident, that they are astrologers. They can see the stars. They're wise men. That makes sense. But people also call them kings as well, and I was wondering, where did that idea come from?
Yeah, they become kings very, very pretty early. I mean, within a couple hundred years of Matthew, they're sort of these royal figures, and I think that probably what gets that started is the value of their gifts, right? That is sort of a one of the things that kind of contributes to, well, they must have been very wealthy. Another thing that kind of starts to happen, though, is that there is this kind of interpretation that develops of them that they are three people. Well, in Matthew didn't actually say three, but early on it's generally always three, sometimes more, but we'll just go with three for now. But there's this idea that they are sort of coming from all of these different areas of the world, and so that they are kind of representative. They are representatives of various different nation groups, ethnic groups, or whatever, and they're all sort of converging on Bethlehem. And that interpretation, I don't think, is really present, or that meaning is not really present in Matthew, but it is one of the ways that story gets interpreted very early, is that they are kind of these representatives, envoys, as it were, from all these different regions. And so that doesn't, if you've got an envoy from a certain region who is bringing an expensive gift, doesn't take long before that translates into, and they were definitely some sort of leader or something like that. But then also this sense of these traditions of people coming and paying tribute to leaders as a way of saying, I am sort of subservient to you. There's stories of Herod, for example, sort of, he builds a city in honor of Caesar, and people come to the emperor of Rome in order to sort of swear their allegiance or something like that. And so I don't think Matthew is imagining them as kings, but if you're reading Matthew in that kind of story world of, well, these people have come to this king in order to give him these gifts, it doesn't take much to sort of make that leap. They must be, kings coming to swear their allegiance to him.
So we can't just blame it on the Christmas Carol.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. No, that song is participating in a long tradition of interpreting these as kings. You've got you've got very, very early on they're called kings.
There's one text you talked about where they had armies, and they had three different armies, and they brought them to Jesus.
Yeah, that's the Armenian gospel of the infancy, and it's wild, right? And they show up with tens of thousands of troops, and they camp outside Jerusalem. And then the people in Jerusalem are terrified, which is a weird detail, right? The Magi show up in Matthew, and the whole city is terrified. Well, why are they terrified in Matthew? Well, the Armenian gospel of the infancy answers that question. The city was under siege, or at least it looked like it was. So yeah, that's a very, very interesting, very, very interesting take on the story.
I guess one of the more unfortunate parts of the legacy of the Magi, one of the things you talk about in your book, is that they end up being used for anti-Semitic purposes quite early on as well. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, that is one of the most unfortunate uses of this story, and it was one that I didn't really recognize until I really started getting into these texts. I had heard this interpretation, and the interpretation that sort of one of the interpretations that dominates biblical scholarship on Matthew is that the Magi in Matthew are supposed to be understood first and foremost as Gentiles. and not only as Gentiles, but the best Gentiles. Like these are the best. I can't remember what scholar refers to them this way, but these are the best that the Gentile world has to offer. So the best of the best. And they, and then the way that this interpretation plays out then is that the Magi are representing the Gentiles, and that Herod and his soldiers or whatever represent the Jews. The Gentiles want to worship Jesus. The Jews want to kill him. And so this is this very unfortunate interpretation that plays out again in a lot of modern biblical scholarship, and it's not just modern biblical scholarship. It's something that does sort of start, like many interpretations, it starts very early, and so you do have people who are talking about, well, the Magi are Gentiles from the East, and they are the ones who come to Jesus and recognize his significance, whereas the residents of Jerusalem don't. And one of the things that I want to be very clear on is, is it the case that Matthew imagines these Magi as Gentiles? Maybe, but that's certainly not the most interesting thing about them for Matthew. So if Matthew wanted to refer to them as Gentiles, he could have, or something else. If he wanted to just highlight that they were non-Jews, he could have called them, the ethnoi, or whatever, the people. He could have used that designation if that was his point, but he didn't. He chose this very, very laden term to refer to them. And so, if they are Gentiles, that is, according to Matthew, the least interesting thing about them. Right? And so it's interesting that I think in that period of, what we call the parting of the ways, right? Matthew is being interpreted after Judaism and Christianity have sort of become their own distinct entities for a variety of reasons. And so Matthew's being interpreted in that light, and so people are imposing that screen onto there and saying, oh, see, look here, we have already at the start the Jews versus the Gentiles. And so that's a way that the story has been used and misused, and I don't find any evidence in Matthew that was his point.
Yeah, okay, so they're trying to set it up as like good Gentiles versus unbelieving Jews.
And I should sort of back up and say that it's not just that they are good Gentiles, it's that they are often Gentiles who are actually very wicked, but they acknowledge that they need to be liberated from their wickedness. And so that story develops as well, especially in patristic authors of, these figures are wicked, they're almost demonic, and then they come to Jesus and they're healed from all of this. Whereas the implication being, well, and Herod and his people are also equally wicked, but they don't repent, right? And so there's sort of this, the Magi become, in a lot of patristic literature, there's this focus on their conversion. There's sort of this sort of conversion experience that they have, whereas that's not present among Herod and his people. All Herod wants is to retain power.
And it's not really evident that they're trying to convert to anything in Matthew, though, is it?
No, I mean, it's, the funny thing is with the prominence of religious dimensions of the Magi in our other ancient sources, it's absolutely fascinating that Matthew doesn't really show any interest in that. Like Matthew doesn't have, there's a word, the Greek word that is used to describe what they do when they get to Bethlehem, proskuneo. Sometimes means worship, or sometimes can be rightly translated as worship, like, bowing before a deity. But it often in Matthew just means bowing. And so, bowing is a sign of respect. And I think that's probably closer to what's going on in Matthew, is that, again, these are figures who are paying tribute to the rightful king. They're not necessarily worshiping him as a deity. But yeah, Matthew certainly doesn't have any sense of them, or if he does have a sense of them converting or taking on new religious identity or anything like this, he doesn't say anything about it. He just sort of leaves it unsaid. But there's these little details that Matthew does include that later interpreters read as a sign of, their quote unquote conversion. Like, they go to Bethlehem, but then they leave by another route, right? And so this just kind of blows up as like, you go to Jesus and then you leave changed or something like that. But Matthew, in Matthew, they're doing this because they're afraid of Herod. They're not doing this because they have some sort of new lease on life. They're just going home and they're just taking a different route.
Do you find it interesting that the Magi only appear in Matthew?
I find it really fascinating, and it makes me wonder. It makes me wonder where the story comes from. Whether it's a story that Matthew, inherits or hears, or whether it's something that Matthew creates. Without getting too much into the weeds of the synoptic problem debate of how are Matthew and Luke related. Plenty of biblical scholars say that they're related only through Mark and through Q. I actually think it's really interesting to think about the possibility that Luke is using Matthew's birth story, and that Luke changes the visitors from Magi to shepherds. He changes, if Luke is using Matthew's birth story, then he's changing a lot of details. But I think it's an interesting hypothesis to say, Luke really doesn't like Magi very much. He doesn't like the people associated with that term. He's got two characters in the book of Acts who are called Magi, and both of them are despicable. Like neither of them are very good. And so if Luke is using Matthew's story, he probably would have been horrified that Matthew has Magi showing up to Jesus's birth. And so again, it's a kind of interesting thought to entertain. I don't have a horse in that race at the moment, though.
Okay, I never thought about the possibility that Luke could have just really disliked the idea of Magi and so edited that part of the story.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. Obviously, viewers should read your book. There's so much more information in there. It's called The Magi, and I will leave links to that in the description.
Yeah, thank you for having me.